Saryn is one of the most popular frames out there, and there are a ton of videos on her. While I initially felt like I didn't need to make a video, I decided why not just create one big guide on her and talk about everything Saryn. Her abilities, all of her synergies with her different weapons, how to keep her alive, as well as how to build her as a beginner player. So before we hop into the abilities, why Saryn? What makes her so popular? What makes her so special? And why does everyone in the Warframe community talk about her? Well, picture a frame that has the ability to nuke every faction. She is able to spread corrosive to Grineer enemies to strip their armor. She can also spread toxin onto corpus enemies to ignore their shields and go straight for their health, all while buffing your toxin procs with viral. Not to mention she can have up to 3 abilities that purely buff your damage. So she can make any weapon basically kill any faction, even Murmur, any faction, it does not matter with her. So yeah, that's Saryn for you. The ultimate gun buffing / nuke frame in Warframe. However, she sucks at surviving, which we are going to fix in this video. So let's dive straight into her abilities. Saryn's passive is status effects inflicted by Saryn's weapons or abilities last 25% longer, which is super nice to have since Saryn naturally does toxin damage as well as corrosive and viral. Her first ability is called Spores. Saryn will cast spores onto an enemy, infecting them for an infinite duration. Each spore will inflict corrosive damage per second with a 50% chance to proc a corrosive status effect. This status chance is increased with ability strength. This will last until the spores are destroyed or the enemy is killed. If you shoot the spores on the enemy or hit them with your melee, the spore will burst and will spread to all nearby enemies within 16 meters at base range and will grow on the new hosts. If you recast, the spores will consume 20% of the current damage per second that you have built up on the bottom right of your screen from the infection meter, and the ability cost will be reduced by 50% every time you recast. If you recast on an infected enemy, a new set of spores will grow, which will carry up to 12 spores. 12 spores is the maximum amount of spores that can be on an enemy, and the amount of spores affects the amount of ticks per second basically. When you cast your spores onto them, the spores will deal 10 corrosive damage per second. But the damage dealt will slowly grow over time and will eventually cap at 100,000 damage. If no enemies are affected by spores, then the damage stored up will decay at 10% of the new total every half second, until it reaches the starting amount. So you want to keep at least one enemy infected. Okay, that was a bit confusing, but basically the bottom line is you want to keep at least one enemy infected at all times so you don't lose all the damage you've built up. You will see all the damage from spores and everything on the bottom right of your screen. Now, Spores will synergize with her 3rd and 4th ability, which I will go over in a second. Spores has an augment called Venom Dose. Venom Dose is activated when you hold to cast Spores and will grant you and your allies additional corrosive damage to your attacks. This augment scales with strength and duration. This is a very good augment to use. Personally, it's a must-have for Saryn, as the augment gives your weapons corrosive, which means you can armor strip a lot faster, and will also allow you to mod for other things on your weapons. Spores has another augment called Revealing Spores, which is kind of useless if I'm going to be honest, since we have enough enemy radar nowadays with the inbuilt 30 meters plus animal instinct on our companions. It's not needed. I don't see the need for this augment at all. Her second ability is called Molt. Molt is Saryn's survivability. Shade your skin like a snake and leave a decoy behind you to draw enemy fire. It will also cleanse your status effects on cast, and it will increase your movement speed by 50% for 5 seconds. The decoy will, at base, have 400 shields and 500 health. As you deploy the decoy, it will be invulnerable for 3 seconds, and all incoming damage will be absorbed and converted to its health. If it dies, it will explode, dealing toxin damage to nearby enemies with a guaranteed toxin proc. Only one Molt can exist at a time. Now here is the thing with this ability. Molt is practically one of the best abilities in the game to shield gate with, hence why shield gating with Saryn is so popular. You see, her second ability doesn't have any casting animation nor cooldown. You can effectively spam this ability as much as you want. As long as you have energy, you can recast Molt. Which means pairing Molt with good energy sustain, brief respite, or an auger mod, well, you can see where this is going. You have every shield gator's dream right here. However, I do know many of you don't like shield gating, so I do have another setup for you later on in the video. Molt has an augment called Regenerative Molt. This allows you to regenerate health over time for 10 seconds. The amount of health gained per second is affected by ability strength, but this augment is not affected by ability duration, however. Even if your Molt dies, it will not cancel out the 10 seconds. You will still get the health regen. This is a good augment if you're a fan of health tanking and don't like shield gating, otherwise I don't think this augment is worth it at all. We then move on to Toxic Lash. Now, let's just pause right here. This ability alone is a lot. It is an incredibly complex ability. So it's time to put our thinking caps on, my good tenor. I'm going to do my best to simplify this as much as I can and not blabber on while throwing maths at you. Toxic Lash is an ability that buffs your weapons with toxin damage, but it will deal a percentage of the weapon's total damage as toxin damage, and it will create a new instance of damage. This toxin damage is doubled for melee weapons. This percentage will obviously scale with ability strength. You will guarantee a toxin proc every strike. This is also affected by multi-shot. So the more multi-shot your weapon has, the more toxin procs you deal per shot, which means more damage. Just as an example, if we do 1000 damage per hit, and at base we do 30% as toxin damage, we will hit for 1000 damage and do an extra 300-ish toxin damage, and then it will do a damage over time because it's a toxin proc. It's not exactly 30%, please take that with a pinch of salt. Like I said, it's an incredibly complex ability with the calculations as there are other factors at stake, but it's around there. It's just an example for you to understand. Point is, it will create an extra instance of damage and will do a lot more damage basically. So instead of a flat damage bonus like other abilities, this buff does a percentage of your weapon damage dealt. Toxic Lash is also affected by your mods on your weapons, meaning if you mod for toxin on your weapons, even if they are combined, it will add to Toxic Lash's damage. Venom Dose, your first ability's augment, will also increase the toxin damage because it boosts your weapons with corrosive, which is of course made up of toxin and electricity. Faction damage mods will also affect Toxic Lash, but in a very interesting way. If you shoot an enemy with Toxic Lash and have a faction damage mod on your weapon, faction damage mods will boost the damage from your weapons, the damage from the Toxic Lash hit, as well as the dot from the toxin procs. This means that if you pair a Bane with Toxic Lash, it will effectively triple dip the damage dealt to enemies. So, to summarize what I've just said, if you're wanting to boost your Toxic Lash damage, mod for ability strength to increase the base percentage. Having multi-shot on your weapon will increase the amount of toxic procs per shot. Modding your weapons for Toxin and a Bane will help the toxin damage dealt, especially Banes, considering it will triple dip the damage. Modding for Viral or Corrosive will help you since Viral will boost the damage over time, whereas Corrosive will lower the enemy armor, thus increasing the damage over time from your Toxin procs. However, Venom Dose does give you Corrosive on your weapons too, so modding for Viral is a bit better in my opinion. Toxic Lash will also synergize with your first ability by popping the Spores on enemies affected by your one. And that's Toxic Lash summarized. We do have another synergy that you can pair with this ability later on, but for now that is all you need to know about Toxic Lash and how it works. Her third ability has an augment called Contagion Cloud. Toxic Lash will create a 5-meter toxic cloud, dealing toxin damage per second for 12 seconds with every kill. Melee kills will also double the damage dealt by these clouds. This is a nice augment which will boost your damage by quite a bit, although this is not absolutely needed. To be honest, it's not that great in my opinion. It's nice to have with certain synergies and certain niche, use cases, but this is down to your personal preference. Saryn's fourth ability is called Miasma. Release a poisonous miasma that deals viral damage to enemies in range. Enemies that are affected by Spores, your first ability, take 400% more damage from this ability. When you cast Miasma, it will stun enemies and sicken them for 6 seconds. The nice thing about this is Viral will boost your toxin procs damage over time. Miasma is the general subsume slot for Saryn. You will usually keep Miasma if you are running a nuke build and you are focusing on killing enemies with your Spores. So Miasma's only purpose is to boost your damage from your Spores and apply Viral onto your enemies. You can further maximize Miasma's damage by casting your Spores to armor strip them, then hit them with a Toxic Lash to apply Toxin, and then cast Miasma to apply Viral so that the Toxin procs will do more damage, thus deleting groups of enemies. However, I will say though that Miasma only applies 1 viral proc per cast, which is not the greatest. That pretty much concludes Saryn's abilities. It's a lot I know, but that's everything that you need to know how she works. Let's quickly talk about how we get her. You can obtain Saryn through Keller Thame on Mera, which is on Sedna. Or you can farm her through Circuit, and if you want Saryn Prime, you will need to farm the respective relics for her. Now let's talk about Saryn's gameplay loop and how to play her in general missions. When you are playing Saryn for general missions, you want to be proccing your Spores as much as possible. Spores will do a lot of damage in Star Chart, but when it comes to Steel Path, Spores become more of an AoE armor stripper than a damage dealer. However, Spores will stack up enough damage over time. If scaled enough, will do a lot of damage in steel paths, and the spores can become a damage dealer. Bottom line is you want to keep your spores up as much as possible to proc corrosive procs, helping you armor strip your enemies. If you are using Venom Dose, always keep it up by holding to cast, giving you a nice corrosive damage boost on your weapons. Molt is your oh crap button, cleansing you of your status effects and used if you are shield gating with Brief Respite on Saryn. It's also used to distract enemies as much as it can. Like I said earlier, the beauty of this ability is the no casting animation, allowing you to spam it at will. Toxic Lash is a massive damage boost to any weapon that you are using. This is the nice thing about Saryn. Even if you just use Venom Dose and Toxic Lash, these two abilities alone can boost your weapon's damage so much that you don't have to subsume another damage dealing ability on her fourth. So keep this ability up at all times. Then when your spores have spread to a bunch of enemies, periodically keep recasting Miasma to increase your spore damage over time, as well as stunning them for 6 seconds, which gives Saryn a decent amount of CC, helping you to stay alive. And that's the gameplay loop for Saryn as a base frame. Pretty straightforward to play, she's not overly complicated at all. Now this brings me onto Saryn's biggest issue, her survivability. Saryn can deal insane amounts of damage through her abilities and weapons, but she doesn't have a lot going for her when it comes to staying alive. So how can we fix this issue? Well, there are many ways that we can do this. In Star Chart, if you find that you are dying, you can make use of simple mods to help her stay alive. Like making use of an Augur mod to convert a portion of the energy spent to shields every time you cast your abilities. If you can, and have the opportunity to, you can buy or farm Brief Respite and use that, which should sort you out for the most part in terms of her survivability. In the Star Chart, you should be good on surviving if you're spamming Miasma and Molt to keep yourself alive. When it comes to Steel Path, well, this is where Saryn becomes a glass cannon. The first method is using a shield gating setup. Here you would make use of Brief Respite and Augur mod, which is optional. Catalyzing shields, this is because with Saryn Prime, catalyzing shields will drop her shields to about 74 shields. Each Molt cast will be 50 energy per cast at 100% efficiency. 50 times 150% equals 75 shields per Molt cast, meaning max shields. You can then use Rolling Guard. Now I know what you're thinking. Yes, Molt cleanses you of your status effects. Yes, I am fully aware of this, but we are using Rolling Guard for its invulnerability, not its status cleanse. Although the status cleanse is an extra nice thing to have. This is a particularly good method if you're wanting to run endurance or high level content. The second method is a simple health tanking setup. For health tanking, you can make use of adaptation for the damage reduction. This is optional, but you can run health conversion to increase your armor drastically, or you can run a vitality mod. If you have it available, Arcane Blessing to increase your max health, and Arcane Reaper, otherwise Arcane Guardian, if you don't have one of those two. This method is for those of you who simply don't enjoy shield gating, and this way is particularly good for just base steel path, maybe a little bit of scaling, or just normal missions. The third method is a shield tanking setup. Now this is actually inspired by my Ember video. It was a build idea given to me from a stream by a viewer who goes by Akocious. Here we make use of adaptation because adaptation affects the damage dealt to shields. We use redirection or primed redirection depending on if you have the primed version, Arcane Aegis, and then we subsume Eclipse onto your fourth ability to make use of the Lunar Eclipse, which gives us a further 75% damage reduction. This is such a nice setup if you just want to focus on weapons, and if you're not doing level cap content or scaling into super high levels, this setup works incredibly well. Since you will have more shields, enemies will deal way less damage to your shields, thus proccing Arcane Aegis more often, meaning you just simply won't die. I highly recommend this method for Saryn or any other frame. Outside of subsuming certain abilities to keep Saryn alive more, we have one more method which I think MH Blackie was the first one to talk about it, which is making use of the Rakta Dagger. This dagger has a unique status effect called Mind Haze, allowing you to leech shields when you deal damage to enemies affected by radiation. Pairing this dagger with melee influence to spread the radiation to nearby enemies will also proc this dagger's unique status effect. This allows you to survive with Saryn a lot more. This is the Rakta Dagger Dark build. This is more of a stat stick or utility build, should I say, focusing on proccing radiation and electricity as much as possible. This weapon can actually do a lot of damage when built correctly. Here is the damage build, which would net the same result, just more damage with Saryn. A super useful weapon to not even just use on Saryn, you can use it on any other frame too. That pretty much sums up all the ways to keep Saryn alive. I will go over more builds later on that will also increase her survivability, so just keep watching for that. Before we go further, if you could smash that like button, this video took me very long to make and it really helps me out with the algorithm. Thank you so much. Let's talk about Saryn and her synergy with Xata's Whisper. I'm sure by now you have heard of Saryn with Xata's Whisper. Why does this work so well? Xata's Whisper is a damage boosting ability from Zaku. This ability creates a bubble around the enemies when it is active. This bubble is pretty much a giant bullet attractor, but whenever you have shot the enemy and the bubble procs, is where the bullets will attract to. So if you shoot at the leg, all bullets will redirect to the leg when it enters the bubble. Same thing with a headshot. If you land a headshot and proc the Xata bubble, you will create a giant headshot bullet attractor. So you see why Xata is so good. But this is not exactly why Xata works so well. The Xata bubble also creates another instance of damage just like Toxic Lash does. When Xata is active, it will empower your weapons with void damage and deal at 100% strength 26% of your total weapon's damage. But it will inflict 1 extra hit per damage instance. So let's say you have 2 multi-shot on your weapon, meaning you will do 2 hits per shot. Xata will add 2 extra instances of damage onto that. You see the idea here and why it's so overpowered. You have Toxic Lash that applies an extra instance of toxin damage as well as triple dipping with Banes and a DOT. Then you have Xata, which adds even more layers of damage instances onto that while dealing void damage as well. Not to mention the damage boost you get from Venom Dose. With all of this, you get Gun Buff Saryn, an extremely popular way to play Saryn. But Gun Buff Saryn is not limited to just Xata's Whisper. No. She is so strong from her first augment and Toxic Lash that you can subsume any of the damage increasing abilities onto her 4th ability and it will work extremely well. Raw, Eclipse, Nourish, and so on. We will go over all the builds later on in the video. Please forgive me, Saryn is just so complex that I want to bunch up all the info into sections, so yeah, just stick with me here. But you get the idea here and why Saryn is such a great weapons platform. I mean, with a helmet, almost her entire kit is designed to boost your weapon's damage. With some way or another, it's just amazing. Saryn can literally take any weapon that you deem to be mid or trash and just make it great. Alright, that covers some of her synergies. We are now going to go over Saryn's builds. We have 12 builds for this video. Yes, I had to use the Tenacon Saryn to make more builds. That's how diverse this frame is. So just bear with me here. We're going to start with the beginners. For the lower level players, I'm talking super early. This build is for those of you who have received a free Saryn from Tenacon, or maybe Saryn was your first prime, or you just farmed her. You're not going to have fancy mods, so all you need is the following. Start with Stretch, Equilibrium, Flow, and Continuity. If you want to invest more, then use Streamline. And I always suggest this, if you can farm about 5 platinum, you can buy a mod called Energy Nexus from another player. This will help you so much and make your life so much easier for energy sustain, especially in the early game. Energy Nexus gives you 3 energy regen per second. It is a lifesaver when it comes to the early game. It is a must-have. If you have more capacity, then you can add Intensify. The aura can be anyone you have available that matches the polarity slot. Now, when you start to progress later on in the star chart, you will begin to feel Saryn's squishiness. So there are 2 options to stay alive. 1, you can equip Fast Deflection to allow you to quickly regen your shields, especially when you cast Miasma, which will stun enemies for 6 seconds. Or, you can invest into Saryn a bit more by obtaining an Augur mod. This will convert a portion of your energy spent when you cast an ability to shields. Alternatively, you can farm Brief Respite, which works even better. You can farm it or you can buy it, it is your choice. I would recommend obtaining it somehow as you will be using this mod later on in the game. Brief Respite converts 150% of your energy spent to shields. A super handy mod to have, but this is only needed much later on in the star chart, not right at the beginning. That's really all you need as a beginner build in the star chart. If you still have a mod slot free, you can get Venom Dose to boost your damage further. This will be a nice cheap budget build for star chart players. Now, as we move into Steel Path, this is where you would probably have felt how much of a glass cannon Saryn can be. So how do we keep her alive? Well, we refer to the survivability section of this video where I explain each of the ways to keep her alive. At base Steel Path, you want to have either Rolling Guard or Adaptation depending on which type of tanking you want to do. Please, I want to make this very clear, any mod that you see as a primed version, just use the normal version if you want to make it budget or you simply don't have the primed version. For a base no helmet steel pass build, you want to use a build like this. This is a shield gating setup. When it comes to the arcanes for Saryn, they are flexible, but if you can, Molt augmented or Molt efficiency, arcane energize or arcane aegis, or any other one you want for your specific setup. If you are not a fan of shield gating, you can use a health tanking setup like this. This is where I would suggest using health conversion, adaptation, arcane blessing, and arcane reaper or arcane guardian. This is also a no helmet setup. We then move on to a nuking setup. This build is for those of you who simply want to nuke with Saryn, making use of her first and fourth ability and just really juicing it up to the max. This build can work well in steel pass, but there is a but here. This is quite an expensive setup. You can make it work with a more budget version, that is possible, but to really maximize the damage as well as keeping yourself alive, it can be pricey depending on how much you're willing to invest into her. Here we focus on a lot of range and building as much strength as possible, and I would recommend using Arcane Energize. If you don't have it and you're struggling for energy sustain, then I would recommend dropping Stretch for Streamline. I would also recommend running 2 green shards for corrosive and then maybe some strength shards here. Please feel free to change around the build to your liking, especially if you find you're squishy, you can change it to make use of adaptation or roll and guard. Now that we have gone over all the non-helmet builds, let's actually talk about the helmet setups with Saryn. The first one is a shield tanking setup. This is by far my favorite if you don't want to die with Saryn and you are not scaling or running super high level enemies. Here we subsume Eclipse onto our 4th ability to make use of the Lunar Eclipse, which is the 75% damage reduction. Make use of redirection, adaptation, and arcane aegis. I already explained this in the survivability section, but yeah, that's how the setup works. The beauty is you still get a huge damage boost from Venom Dose and Toxic Lash, all while being super tanky with Saryn. Just make sure to keep Eclipse up as long as possible to keep up the damage reduction from this ability. I would highly recommend using this setup. I absolutely love it, and I think you will too. I also have a Saryn ESO nuking setup for those of you who want to focus farm with Saryn. We subsume Dispensary onto our 2nd ability and pretty much just spam our 1st and our 4th. You can also subsume over Toxic Lash too. This is an old setup, but I'm pretty sure it is still viable. It is an arbitration build which forms part of the meta arbitration squad. Saryn is a huge damage increase for the team. We subsume energized munitions onto your 4th ability and use an Ogris for arbitrations, and of course Venom Dose to boost your teammates with corrosive damage. I'm pretty sure this build is still good to use. I may be wrong. If I am, then please comment down below, anyone who does meta arbitration runs. If you feel like getting creative with surviving with Saryn, you can subsume Shooting Gallery onto your 4th ability and make use of the Augment Cord Muzzle Flash. This is a really nice playstyle that offers you a lot of CC to distract enemies, consistently blinding them and jamming their weapons. It's a really nice endurance setup as well. We have an Expedite Suffering build, which is particularly good if you're using Saryn to take out tougher targets or just enemies that are grouped together, like Thraxes, Xmas units, Demolishers, and so on. You can also pair the setup with the Nautilus and Cordon to group enemies together and apply a bunch of Toxin from Toxic Lash, past Expedite Suffering to delete groups of enemies. This is what the build looks like. It's really fun. Moving on to a melee focused playstyle, as Saryn does particularly well with melees because of Toxic Lash. Here we subsume Wrathful Advance onto our 4th ability, and this is just focused on melees. We get juicy red crits and we make use of the shield tanking setup, except we don't have the 75% reduction from Eclipse. It still does work though. We then move on to our gun buff builds. The first one is Raw. If you find the energy sustain is too difficult with negative efficiency, or simply don't have energize, you can switch out the build for more efficiency, or you can drop Blind Rage. We then have Xata Whisper, which is the exact same build but just with a different subsume. To finish it off, you can subsume Nourish onto your 4th ability and just use the same build as Energy Stain. Would be a lot easier, and you can switch out Energize to something more flexible. That concludes all of Saryn's builds for this video. If you want other helmet suggestions, you can use Gloom, a Pool ability, Condemn for the ultimate shield gating, and Breach Surge, and so on. That was a lot, I'm aware. We are almost there. There are a couple more sections we need to talk about, but let's talk about Archon shards with Saryn and the importance of them with her. Saryn does mainly toxin damage, so you guessed it, green shards. That's right. But with Saryn, her spores deal corrosive damage. Putting 2 green corrosive shards that increase the max corrosive procs allows Saryn to become a huge AoE armor stripper. I would highly recommend running 2 green shards for corrosive or running 1 tile forged, as having just shy of a full armor strip is okay nowadays considering the recent armor changes. But full armor strip is of course better. Then on the same note of green shards, you can consider using the toxin status effects deal 30% more damage. With Saryn, as you can imagine, this is quite a huge damage bonus, and it's very good and works well with her as well. So you can run a full green shard Saryn if you want to. Alternatively, I would recommend red shards running strength or duration depending on what you want. And when it comes to amber shards, I will be honest, casting speed is not that needed on Saryn. Most of Saryn's abilities have very short casting animations, and Molt doesn't even have one. Miasma is the one that is relatively slow with casting speed. Other than that, I don't think it's worth it, or maybe just one if you really want to. Parkour velocity is always a go-to for quality of life with any frame. I do want to add this in. I personally have not tested it, but if you want to, you could run the +2 health each time enemies are damaged with a toxin status effect, which I can imagine would work very well with the health tanking build if you opt for that as someone who doesn't like shield gating. Alright, that covers Archon shards with Saryn. Let's talk about Saryn and her synergy with Blast. As we all know now, Blast has been reworked. We understand now that Blast explodes for a percentage of the damage dealt, and at max stacks, the explosion will deal 300% of the base damage per proc. But what is interesting is Saryn synergizes with Blast very well because of Toxic Lash. Kai made a video on this, so please go and watch his video. He explains it very well and goes on in depth about it. Toxic Lash has its own instance of damage, as we know. When you apply a blast proc on an enemy and it explodes, it will act as another damage instance from your weapon and will apply a toxin proc from Toxic Lash from the explosion of the blast proc. So if you apply, let's say, 5 blast procs on an enemy with Toxic Lash and they all explode shortly after, you will get 5 extra toxin procs. Now that's great and all, but where it becomes interesting is when the enemies either die or get to max stacks and you receive the huge damage increase from the blast explosion. That 5-meter explosion will spread a toxin proc to nearby enemies, but the toxin proc will receive a damage bonus from the blast explosion, thus giving nearby enemies a juiced toxin proc. So it just means more and more damage with Saryn. It's ridiculous at this point. This effectively means any weapon that you have modded with Saryn and pairing it with Toxic Lash will be insanely satisfying and do a significant amount of damage. Plus you can add Raw onto it as well to add even more damage onto your weapon. Another synergy that works incredibly well with Blast and Saryn is the Ogris. The Ogris has a mod called Nightwatch Napalm, which creates flames in a radius which will apply heat to enemies. And guess what? This paired with Toxic Lash also applies toxin procs from each hit tick because it acts as if it's a damage from your weapon. And then you can mod for Blast on the Ogris, which effectively means you have Toxic Lash applying toxin procs, you have Nightwatch Napalm and the heat procs applying more toxin procs, and then you have the increased damage from the enemies dying from the explosion. You can see how broken this will be. This is what the Ogris build looks like. It's a lot of fun. I would definitely recommend giving it a try. Now let's move on to the infamous Sobek and Acid Shell synergy that pretty much everyone knows with Saryn. So how does this synergy work? The Sobek, or the new Kuva Sobek, has an exclusive mod called Acid Shells. Acid Shells will explode enemies on death, dealing corrosive damage for a percentage of their maximum health. This mod is also affected by Bane, so be sure to pair Acid Shells with a Bane on the Kuva Sobek. Banes actually increase the percentage damage dealt from the explosions, so modding the Kuva Sobek with a Bane is incredibly important, but you would be using a Bane anyway with Toxic Lash. If you pair Acid Shells with Toxic Lash, the explosions from Acid Shells will also apply a Toxin proc from Toxic Lash. This is the same concept as the Blast procs, where the explosion is a hit from your weapon mechanic. But the broken thing with this setup is with each explosion, it will just add more juiced Toxin procs to nearby enemies, allowing you to nuke groups of enemies. Basically, every enemy that is affected by Acid Shell's explosion with Toxic Lash is dead. This is why it's such a deadly combo and allows for some super satisfying gameplay. You can also subsume Raw or Xata to increase the synergy's effectiveness drastically. This is what the Sobek build looks like. I have built it for Blast because if you consider the synergy with Acid Shells as well as the synergy with Blast, it's a nice increase in damage for the enemies affected by the blast in a 5-meter radius. I will say though, having Viral on with Nourish or a Panzer will further increase your damage even more. Not that you need it, to be honest. This is a viral version of the Sobek. If you want a progenitor suggestion, it depends on what you want with the Kuva Sobek. I would say cold because then you can mod for viral or blast, or you can go heat so you can do a viral heat as you will get corrosive from venom dose. Now let's talk about a big list of weapons that work particularly well with Saryn. Just a quick disclaimer, all these builds would be my main ones. If you want to make a budget, you can just use the cheaper mods and build the same type of framework. Pretty much every weapon works incredibly well. This is just a few ones that work particularly well with it. The first is the dual Ichor Incarnate. This is because of the synergy with Toxic Lash as well as the toxin fields that form from the dual Ichor Incarnate evolution. You can also pair this with Contagion Cloud to add even more toxin damage, and this is what the build looks like. Up next is the Bobonico with the alternate fire. Works incredibly well with Toxic Lash and a normal gun buff Saryn build. This is the build here. The dual Toxicist, while already being broken, is extra strong with the gun buff Saryn. This is what the build looks like. The Turret Incarnate, modded for Blast, is deadly with Saryn, as I explained earlier why Blast is so good with her. The nice thing about the turret is the chaining beams, and this is the setup. Same thing with the Tenet Galaxian, except we have a progenitor which you can choose cold or heat to make Blast. It's your choice. The Strun Incarnate is a status hose with very high multi-shot, so pairing this with Toxic Lash is deadly. The Proboscis Cernos with this unique trait pulling enemies in is really good, especially with Blast and the synergy with Toxic Lash. It's a really fun setup that I would recommend playing. The Corinth with the alternate fire is incredibly fun and satisfying to play with the explosions paired with gun buff Saryn. Here is the build we run. The Serata, you knew it was going to be on this list. In all honesty, any glaive with Saryn is disgusting, whether it's a Zorus or Pathicist or Serata and so on, it's just disgusting. Here is the Serata build. The Furus is broken with heat, but with Saryn it's even stronger. The Mitre Incarnate with its ricocheting discs is absolutely amazing. This is the setup we run for the Mitre, and I have saved the best for last. Well, they're not the best, they're just my personal favorite with Saryn. The Ocucore with Sentient Surge is already broken. Now pairing it with Saryn is just wow. This thing clears insanely well with a gun buff Saryn build. I would highly recommend running an Ocucore with Saryn. This is the setup. The last one is the Sampotes. I never know how to say this weapon's name. This weapon has a unique trait where if you slam attack, it will send out a wave of explosions in a 40-meter line. But if you slam heavy attack, it will release 4 explosions in a wide angle. This paired with Saryn does millions of damage and literally deletes groups of enemies with a raw build. It's incredibly powerful. That concludes my little list for you. Again, I want to reiterate that any weapon with unique synergies and such are really good with gun buff Saryn builds. It's not limited to this list. If you have any weapons that you personally enjoy with Saryn, be sure to pop it in the comments below so other people can try it out. To bring this big video to conclusion, Saryn is great. In my opinion, the sweet spot for her is base steel part and maybe a little endurance and survival. She will demolish everything in Warframe and she is super satisfying to play. You just have to watch out to keep her alive depending on which playstyle you chose to keep her alive. Some are easier than others, but again, it depends on what you like. I would highly recommend getting her. She offers you so much and she's very useful in many situations. Otherwise, this video has gone on for long enough. Thank you so much for watching. If it helped you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to see more content like this. Also, don't forget to follow my Twitch. As always, a huge thank you to all of my amazing channel members and a special thank you to Bagul, Chum, Joshua, Corix, Shakiro, Darwin, Gilbert, Ayrton Tythrax, King Wonderbread, Villa, and Oddity Racing. Thank you so much for your generous support. I will see you all in the next one.